Georgia Martinez had cleaned a lot of strange things in her 24 years. Taxidermied peacocks, indoor koi ponds, even a room full of vintage typewriters that hadn't been touched in decades. But she'd never been asked to talk to plants as part of her job description. That peculiar request would come on a Tuesday afternoon in March, whispered by a 17-year-old boy who could barely look her in the eye. And it would change both of their lives in ways neither could have predicted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Whitmore estate sat on 12 acres in Greenwich, Connecticut, hidden behind iron gates and a row of Japanese maples that turned the driveway into a tunnel of green every spring. Georgia had worked there for 8 months, long enough to know which floorboards creaked, which windows stuck, and which rooms the family actually used versus the ones that existed purely for show. She arrived each morning at 7:30, parking her decade-old Honda Civic next to the service entrance, where it looked embarrassingly small beside the family's collection of luxury vehicles. The pay was exceptional, nearly twice what she'd made at her previous housekeeping job in Stamford, but the house itself felt more like a museum than a home. Everything was cream-colored and pristine, designed by someone who clearly believed that personality was something to be avoided at all costs. Georgia's own apartment was a cramped studio above a dry cleaner in Port Chester, where the smell of chemical solvents seeped through the floorboards, and the radiator clanked like someone was inside it with a wrench. She'd moved there from Albuquerque 2 years ago with nothing but a duffel bag and a vague plan to save enough money to finish her degree. Her mother had called it running away. Georgia called it making a fresh start after her engagement fell apart, and her college fund evaporated in her father's failed restaurant venture. The Whitmore family consisted of 3 people, though you'd barely know it from how rarely their paths crossed within the vast house. Richard Whitmore, the patriarch, had made his fortune in pharmaceutical distribution and spent most of his time either at his Manhattan office or on business trips to places Georgia had only seen in movies. His wife, Diane, was a ghost of a different kind, present but absent, always dressed immaculately for charity luncheons or gallery openings, speaking in the soft, careful voice of someone who'd learned early that opinions were dangerous things. Then there was Oliver. Georgia had seen him exactly 3 times in her first month of work, always at a distance. He was tall and lanky with dark curly hair that fell into his eyes, giving him a perpetually startled expression. He moved through the house like he was trying not to disturb the air itself, and on the rare occasions when Georgia encountered him in a hallway, he'd mumble something incomprehensible and disappear into whichever room he'd emerged from. He's homeschooled, Mrs. Whitmore had explained during Georgia's initial interview, though it sounded more like an apology than a fact. Oliver is sensitive. He does better with private tutors. What Georgia eventually learned was that Oliver barely did anything with his tutors either. She'd overheard phone conversations, Mrs. Whitmore's end of them. Anyway, where various educators politely resigned, citing Oliver's extreme reticence to participate or his challenges with social engagement. One had used the word selective mutism, which Mrs. Whitmore had repeated to her husband later that evening with the kind of desperation that made Georgia pause her dusting to listen. The therapists say he needs more social interaction, Richard. Real interaction, not just sitting in rooms with hired professionals who are paid to be patient with him. Then enroll him in a school, Richard had replied, his voice carrying the clipped irritation of someone solving a simple problem. You know he can't handle that. Last time he was 14. He's 17 now. He needs to toughen up. The conversation had ended there, followed by the sound of Richard's footsteps heading toward his study and the quiet click of a door that signaled the discussion was over. Georgia tried not to form opinions about the families she worked for. It wasn't her place, and besides, every household had its complications. But there was something particularly sad about the Whitmore house, something that went beyond the sterile decor and separate schedules. It was a place where people existed in parallel rather than together, where problems were mentioned but never solved, where a teenage boy could disappear into his room for days and no one seemed to find it particularly alarming. Her routine was consistent and solitary. She'd start in the kitchen, preparing the coffee that Mrs. Whitmore would drink before her morning yoga session. Then she'd move through the ground floor, dusting, vacuuming, arranging things that were already arranged. The Whitmores generated very little actual mess, which meant Georgia's job was less about cleaning and more about maintaining an illusion of perfect order. Around 10, she'd head upstairs to tackle the bedrooms. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore had separate suites on opposite ends of the second floor. Oliver's room was on the third floor, technically the attic level that had been converted into a sprawling space with slanted ceilings and dormer windows, overlooking the gardens. She was never supposed to go into Oliver's room while he was there. Mrs. Whitmore had been explicit about that. Just knock, and if he doesn't answer, come back later. He values his privacy. What this meant in practice was that Georgia cleaned Oliver's room maybe once a week, always during the narrow window when he was downstairs with whatever tutor hadn't quit yet. The room itself was a fascinating contrast to the rest of the house. Where everything below was beige and minimal, Oliver's space was crammed with life. Books were stacked in precarious towers on every surface. Sketch pads covered the desk, filled with intricate drawings of plants and insects rendered in meticulous detail. And everywhere, on the windowsills, the dresser hanging from ceiling hooks, were plants. Not just a few plants, dozens of them. Ferns and pothos and snake plants and succulents, African violets in purple and pink, a massive fiddle leaf fig in the corner that nearly touched the ceiling. They were all healthy and well-tended, their leaves glossy and vibrant in a way that suggested someone who actually paid attention. Georgia found herself looking forward to those rare opportunities to clean Oliver's room, if only because it felt like the one space in the house where someone actually lived. She'd water the plants if they needed it, careful not to disturb the precise arrangement Oliver had created. Sometimes she'd find notes he'd written to himself, stuck to the wall above his desk. Remember to rotate the fern or repot the jade, roots showing. It was during one of these cleaning sessions, on a grey Tuesday in March, that everything changed. Georgia was wiping down Oliver's windowsill, being careful around a collection of tiny cacti, when she heard a throat being cleared behind her. She spun around to find Oliver standing in the doorway, looking absolutely mortified that he'd startled her. "I'm so sorry," Georgia said immediately, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. "Your mum said you were with your tutor. He cancelled." Oliver's voice was barely above a whisper. He was looking at the floor, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. I didn't mean to," he trailed off, apparently unable to finish the sentence. An awkward silence stretched between them. Georgia considered excusing herself, but something in Oliver's posture, the way he was standing half in and half out of his own room, like he needed permission to enter, made her hesitate. "Your plants are beautiful," she said finally, because it was true, and because the silence felt like it needed filling. "You take really good care of them." Oliver's gaze flickered up for just a second, almost meeting her eyes, before darting away again. "Thanks, they're easier than people." It was the most words Georgia had ever heard him string together. She found herself smiling. "I get that. Plants don't judge you." "Exactly." Something in Oliver's shoulders relaxed slightly. He took a small step into the room. They just need basic things. Water, light, attention. And if you give them those things, they grow. It's predictable. Unlike people, Oliver agreed quietly. Georgia straightened up, setting down her cleaning cloth. She should leave, should give him his space back. But there was something unfolding here that felt important in a way she couldn't quite name. "Do you have a favorite?" she asked, gesturing to the botanical collection surrounding them. Oliver's eyes lit up, actually lit up, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked directly at her. "The philodendron," he said, pointing to a trailing plant with heart-shaped leaves that cascaded from a hanging planter near the window. "I've had it for 3 years. It was the first one I didn't kill, and just like that." Georgia saw not a wealthy recluse or a problem child, but simply a lonely kid who'd figured out how to fill his isolation with something green and growing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The conversation about the philodendron lasted 7 minutes. Georgia had glanced at the clock on Oliver's desk when she finally excused herself. 7 minutes might not sound like much, but it was approximately 6 minutes and 45 seconds longer than any previous interaction they'd had. Over the next 2 weeks, their brief encounters became something neither of them acknowledged, but both seemed to anticipate. Georgia would time her cleaning of the 3rd floor for late morning, right after Oliver's tutoring sessions ended. He'd appear in the doorway, hovering like he was still deciding whether to come in, and they'd talk. Always about the plants at first, how the jade was doing after being repotted, whether the fern needed more humidity, why the tips of the spider plant were turning brown, but gradually the conversations expanded. Oliver mentioned he was supposed to be studying for the SATs, but couldn't focus. Georgia told him about the community college classes she'd been taking online, 1 per semester, chipping away at a degree in early childhood education that felt impossibly far away. He showed her his sketches, detailed botanical illustrations that belonged in a museum. She told him they were good enough to sell, which made him turn red and change the subject. Mrs. Whitmore noticed the shift before Georgia did. "Oliver seems brighter lately," she said one afternoon, catching Georgia in the hallway outside the library. There was something searching in her expression, a mixture of hope and caution. Has he been talking to you?" Georgia felt suddenly defensive, though she wasn't sure why. "Sometimes. Just small talk when I'm cleaning. What do you talk about?" "Plants, mostly. He really knows a lot about them." Mrs. Whitmore's face did something complicated, a flicker of sadness, followed by what might have been relief. "He does. His father thinks it's a waste of time, but—" She trailed off, catching herself before saying something she might regret. "Would you mind continuing? The conversations, I mean, if he initiates them?" "Of course," Georgia said, though the request felt strange, like she was being asked to provide a service beyond her job description. "It's just that he doesn't—" Mrs. Whitmore's voice cracked slightly. She cleared her throat. "He doesn't really talk to anyone? Not meaningfully. The tutors try, the therapists try, but he just shuts down. But with you, maybe because there's no pressure, no agenda." Georgia nodded, unsure what to say. There was something deeply sad about a mother being grateful that her son spoke to the housekeeper. The real catalyst came on a Thursday afternoon in early April. Georgia was in Oliver's room, watering the plants while he sat at his desk, supposedly doing homework. Rain drummed against the windows, turning the world outside grey and blurred. "There's a thing," Oliver said suddenly, his voice tight with anxiety. Georgia looked over. He was gripping his pencil so hard his knuckles had gone white. "What kind of thing?" "A family thing." "Dinner party. My dad's hosting clients next Friday." Oliver's leg was bouncing under the desk, nervous energy radiating from him. "I have to be there. I have to interact." "That doesn't sound so bad," Georgia offered, though she could see it clearly was bad for him. "You don't understand." Oliver's voice rose slightly before he caught himself and brought it back down. "I can't do it. I can't sit there and make small talk and answer their questions about college and what I want to study and whether I play sports. I freeze. My mind goes completely blank and everyone stares at me like I'm defective." Georgia set down the watering can and sat on the edge of Oliver's bed, far enough away not to crowd him. "What happens when you freeze?" "Everything. My throat closes up. I can't think of anything to say. And the longer the silence goes on, The worse it gets, because then everyone's uncomfortable and I'm making it awkward, and I can see my dad getting angry even though he's trying to hide it. Oliver was talking faster now, the words tumbling out like he'd been holding them in for too long. And my mom does this thing where she tries to answer for me or change the subject, which makes it even more obvious that I'm failing. Have you told them how hard it is? Oliver laughed, but there was no humor in it. My dad thinks I'm being difficult on purpose, that I'm choosing to be this way to embarrass him. He keeps saying I need to just get over it, like it's a switch I can flip. Georgia thought about the overhead conversations, Richard's impatient voice insisting his son needed to toughen up. What about the therapists? What do they say? They have strategies, breathing exercises, cognitive reframing, exposure therapy. Oliver said the words like he'd heard them 1,000 times, and it all makes sense in theory, but when I'm actually in the situation, everything they taught me just evaporates. The rain intensified, hammering against the roof. Georgia watched Oliver, this tall 17-year-old who looked younger when he was anxious, and something clicked in her mind. "Do you talk to your plants?" she asked. Oliver blinked, thrown by the sudden change in direction. "What? Your plants? Do you talk to them?" "Some people do. I mean, yeah, sometimes." He looked embarrassed. "Is that weird?" "Not at all. What do you talk about?" Oliver shrugged, but his leg had stopped bouncing. "Nothing specific, just whatever's on my mind. How my day was, what I'm worried about, random observations, and how does that feel? Talking to them? Easy." The word came out immediately, like he'd never thought about it before, but knew it was true. "It feels easy because they're not judging me. They're not waiting for me to say the right thing or be a certain way. They just exist, and I can say anything without it mattering." Georgia leaned forward slightly. "What if you practiced the other way around?" "What do you mean?" "What if you practiced conversations with the plants? Not just talking at them, but actually having conversations, like they're people who might respond. You could practice small talk. Practice answering the questions you know you'll get asked at the dinner party. Practice until your brain gets used to the pattern of it." Oliver stared at her like she'd suggested something absurd. "That's ridiculous." "Maybe," Georgia admitted. "But what if it worked? How would talking to a fern help me talk to my dad's business associates? Because right now, talking to people is this huge, scary thing that only happens in high-pressure situations where everyone's watching you fail. But if you practiced in a safe space where failure didn't matter, where you could mess up and restart without consequences." She paused, working through the logic herself. "Maybe your brain would stop treating conversations like life-or-death situations." Oliver was quiet for a long moment, considering. Outside, the rain began to ease, fading from a roar to a steady patter. "Would you help me?" he asked finally, his voice small. "Help you practice?" "Yeah, I mean, I can't do it alone. I'd feel too stupid. But if you were there, maybe prompting me or—" "I don't know." He looked up at her, and there was something desperate in his expression. "You're the only person I can talk to without completely falling apart." Georgia should have said no. This was far outside her job responsibilities, verging on inappropriate even. But looking at Oliver, at this kid who'd been failed by expensive therapists and impatient parents and a world that demanded social fluency without teaching it, she found herself nodding. "Okay," she said. "Let's try it." Oliver exhaled, something like hope flickering across his face. "Really, really. Tomorrow morning before your tutor gets here. We'll start with the basics." She had no idea if it would work, but she knew for certain that doing nothing wouldn't help at all. And sometimes, Georgia thought, as she left Oliver's room that afternoon, the most ridiculous ideas were the ones worth trying. Georgia barely slept that night. She kept replaying her promise to Oliver, wondering what she'd gotten herself into. By 3 a.m, lying in her cramped studio, listening to someone's car alarm wail in the distance, she'd convinced herself the whole idea was absurd. Who was she to think she could help this kid when trained therapists had failed? She was a housekeeper with an incomplete college degree, not a miracle worker, But when she arrived at the estate the next morning, Oliver was already waiting on the third floor, sitting cross-legged next to his philodendron with an expression that cycled between hopeful and terrified. "You came," he said, as if there'd been any doubt. "I said I would." Georgia set down her cleaning supplies and surveyed the room full of plants, suddenly aware she had no actual plan. "So should we start?" Oliver's face immediately shuttered. "I don't know. Maybe this is stupid. You probably have actual work to do." There it was, the resistance Georgia had expected but hadn't quite prepared for. Oliver wanted help desperately, but accepting help meant acknowledging he needed it, meant trying something that might fail, meant being vulnerable in front of someone who'd see him struggle. "It's not stupid," Georgia said firmly. "But if you don't want to do this, that's okay too. No pressure. It's not that I don't want to." Oliver picked at a loose thread on his jeans. "It's just, what if we try this and it doesn't work? Then what? I'm back to square one, except now I've proven that even the ridiculous plant-talking idea can't fix me." "Or," Georgia countered, sitting down across from him, "what if we try it and it does work? What if this is the thing that makes a difference? Nothing's made a difference so far." "That's not entirely true. You're talking to me right now. That's different than 8 months ago." Oliver considered this. "I guess, but you're different. You don't expect anything from me. The plants don't expect anything either. That's the whole point." Georgia gestured to the philodendron between them. "Look, we don't have to do this. But you've got a week until that dinner party, and right now your strategy is probably to panic increasingly until the event, freeze during it, and feel terrible after. I'm offering an alternative." A long silence stretched out. Through the dormer windows, morning light slanted across the hardwood floor, catching dust motes in its beam. Finally, Oliver nodded, barely perceptible. "Okay, but if I'm too awkward, then you're too awkward. It doesn't matter. That's why we're practicing." Georgia thought for a moment. "Here's what I'm thinking. We start with the plant, but I'll give you prompts. Questions someone might actually ask at the dinner. You respond to the plant like it's asking you. I'm just background noise. That sounds worse somehow, probably. But let's try anyway." Georgia shifted position, making herself comfortable. "Ready?" Oliver looked like he wanted to bolt, but he turned toward the philodendron, staring at its heart-shaped leaves like they might offer guidance. "I guess." "Okay, the plant just asked you. So, Oliver, what are you planning to study in college?" Silence. Oliver's jaw worked like he was trying to form words that wouldn't come. His hands clenched and unclenched. 15 seconds passed, then 30. Georgia could see sweat forming at his hairline. He started, then stopped. "This is exactly what happens. My brain just empties out. That's okay. Let's try something easier." Georgia softened her voice. "The plant says, 'Hey, how's it going?'" "Fine," Oliver managed, his voice strangled. "Good. Now it says, 'What did you do today?'" "Nothing." "I mean, not nothing, just—" Oliver pressed his palms against his eyes. "See, I can't even answer the simplest questions. How am I supposed to survive a whole dinner?" Georgia recognized the spiral beginning, panic feeding on itself, each failed attempt making the next one harder. She'd seen this in herself years ago, when she'd had to drop out of college mid-semester and face her family's disappointment. The way fear could become its own obstacle, larger than whatever you were actually afraid of. "Stop," she said gently. "Look at me, not the plant." Oliver lowered his hands, his eyes miserable. "You know what your problem is? You're trying to give perfect answers. But conversation isn't about perfection. It's about connection, even if it's small and meaningless." Georgia pulled the philodendron closer to herself. "Watch, I'll show you." She turned to the plant with exaggerated casualness. "Hey there, Phil, how's it going?" Then in a slightly different voice, she answered for the plant. "Oh, you know. Just hanging around, photosynthesizing, the usual." Oliver's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Georgia continued, back in her own voice. "Cool, cool. I'm just working, watering some plants. Including you, actually. You need water." Plant voice. "I could use some. My soil's getting pretty dry." Georgia voice. "No problem. So hey, random question. You ever think about what you want to do with your life?" Plant voice. "Man, that's deep for a Thursday morning." "I don't know. Keep growing? Maybe spread to another pot eventually?" I try not to overthink it. This time Oliver actually did smile. That's ridiculous. Exactly. It's supposed to be ridiculous. Conversation doesn't have to be profound or impressive. It just has to be words happening in sequence. Georgia slid the plant back toward Oliver. Your turn. Ask Phil about his weekend plans. This is so weird. Yep, do it anyway. Oliver took a breath, looking at the plant with the intensity of someone defusing a bomb. So, Phil, got any plans for the weekend? Silence. He was waiting for Georgia to answer, but she just gestured for him to continue. Oh, right. Oliver attempted a different voice, higher pitched. I'm probably just going to sit here. Maybe get some sun if it's not cloudy. Pretty exciting stuff. Sounds nice, Oliver said in his normal voice, then immediately looked at Georgia. Was that okay? It was perfect. Keep going. Ask another question. Like what? Anything. What would you actually want to know if Phil could talk? Oliver thought about it. I guess. Whether he likes living here. In this room. Great. Ask him that. Do you like it here? Oliver asked the plant. Then in the Phil voice, yeah, actually. Good light, consistent watering. But my owner talks to me sometimes, which is nice even though he's kind of awkward about it. Oliver laughed at his own joke, then seemed surprised that he'd done so. The tension in his shoulders had decreased slightly. See, Georgia said, you can do this. It's easier when I'm making fun of myself through a plant than make fun of yourself through a plant. Whatever works. Georgia checked her phone. They'd been at this for 20 minutes, and she actually did have work to do. Listen, I need to start on the downstairs, but here's your homework. Practice with different plants. Have full conversations. It doesn't matter what you talk about. The weather, what you had for breakfast, your opinions on whatever. The goal is just to get comfortable with the rhythm of dialogue. Oliver nodded slowly. And you'll come back tomorrow. Every morning this week. We'll build up to harder questions. Georgia stood, brushing off her jeans. One more thing. When you mess up or can't think of what to say, don't spiral. Just acknowledge it and move on. Even in real conversations, people stumble. It's normal. Easy for you to say. Actually, it's not. The words came out before Georgia could stop them. I've had my own stuff. Different than yours, but everyone's fighting something. The people at that dinner party, they're probably worried about impressing your dad, or whether they seem smart enough or whatever. You're not the only person in the room who's scared. Oliver looked at her with something like understanding. Does that actually help? Knowing other people are scared? Sometimes. It reminds you that it's not a performance where everyone's judging you. It's just a bunch of humans fumbling through being human together. Georgia left him there, sitting among his plants, and headed downstairs to tackle the kitchen. But as she worked, she couldn't shake the image of Oliver attempting conversation with a philodendron, his voice uncertain but trying. She also couldn't shake her own doubts. What if this didn't work? What if she was giving him false hope, setting him up for an even worse failure? The dinner party was in 6 days. 6 days to undo 17 years of social anxiety and family dysfunction. It seemed impossible. But then again, Georgia thought as she scrubbed the countertops, so did most worthwhile things. By Friday morning, Oliver had created what he called the conversation corner, a semicircle of 6 plants arranged on his floor like a tiny audience. Georgia found him there at 7:45, already deep in discussion with a pothos about the merits of different pizza toppings. Pineapple is controversial. I know, Oliver was saying to the trailing vine, but texture-wise, it adds something interesting. The sweetness cuts through the salt. Georgia leaned against the doorframe, not wanting to interrupt. This was different from their first session. Oliver's voice was steadier, his posture less rigid. He was actually gesturing as he talked, his hands moving to emphasize points. Okay, but here's where it gets tricky, Oliver continued, shifting to address a snake plant. What if someone at the dinner asks about pineapple on pizza, specifically to test whether I'm the kind of person who has strong opinions about trivial things? Is that a trap? It's not a trap, Georgia said, announcing her presence. Nobody cares that much about pizza toppings. Oliver jumped slightly, but recovered quickly. You don't know these people. My dad's clients are the kind of people who care about everything. Being exactly right, then tell them you appreciate both perspectives on the pineapple debate. Boom. Diplomatic. Answer that says nothing but sounds like something, Georgia. Settled into her usual spot on the floor. But honestly, stop overthinking the content. We need to work on delivery. What's wrong with my delivery? Nothing's wrong with it. But you're still talking like you're afraid the plants will judge you. At the dinner, you need to project at least minimal confidence, even if you're faking it. Oliver's expression flickered with doubt. I don't know how to fake confidence. Sure you do. You fake it every time a tutor shows up and you pretend you've been studying. Georgia smiled at his guilty look. Mrs. Whitmore mentioned you've been going through tutors pretty quickly. They kept trying to make me participate in mock debates. It was horrible. Oliver picked at the carpet. This is different, though. This actually feels like it might work. Why? Because I'm not trying to be someone else. I'm just practicing being a version of me that can handle conversations. He looked up at her, and there was something vulnerable in his expression. Does that make sense? Complete sense. Georgia pulled out her phone. Okay, new exercise. I'm going to record you having a conversation with... She pointed at random. That Fern. You're going to introduce yourself like you're meeting someone for the first time at the dinner party. Record it. Why? So you can see what you actually look like when you talk. Most of the anxiety is in your head. You think you seem worse than you do. Oliver looked horrified. Or I'll see that I'm exactly as awkward as I think I am, and that'll make it worse. Only one way to find out. Georgia positioned her phone, angling it to capture Oliver and the Fern. Ready? Action! Oliver stared at the camera like it was a weapon. I can't. You literally just had a full conversation about pizza. That was different. That was just us. Oliver, Georgia lowered the phone. The dinner party is in 7 days. At some point, you have to actually commit to this. Not just practice in theory, but really try. And that means being uncomfortable. I am uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable right now. I know. Do it anyway. They sat in silence for a long moment, the morning light streaming through the windows, making the dust motes visible in the air between them. Georgia could see Oliver waging an internal war. The part of him that wanted to hide battling the part that was desperate to change. What if I commit to this and it still doesn't work? Oliver's voice was barely above a whisper. What if I try my absolute hardest and I still freeze up and embarrass myself and prove to my dad that I'm exactly the disappointment he thinks I am? There it was, the real fear underneath everything else. Not just social anxiety, but the weight of parental expectation, the feeling of being fundamentally broken, the terror of trying and failing publicly. Georgia set her phone down completely. Can I tell you something? Oliver nodded. 2 years ago, I was engaged to a guy named Marcus. We'd been together since high school, had this whole plan. Get married, buy a house in Albuquerque, have kids. Very traditional, very safe. Georgia surprised herself with how easy it was to talk about this. Then my dad's restaurant failed and took my college fund with it. Marcus said we should postpone the wedding until I finished my degree, which made sense financially. But what he really meant was that he was having second thoughts about marrying someone who came with debt and family drama. Oliver was listening intently, his own anxiety temporarily forgotten. So I had this choice. I could stay in Albuquerque and try to salvage things, keep trying to be the person Marcus wanted, keep trying to convince my family I wasn't a failure for losing my scholarship. Or I could leave and start over somewhere nobody knew me as the girl who couldn't keep it together. Georgia traced a pattern on the carpet. Leaving felt like admitting defeat, like I was running away from my problems instead of facing them. But you left anyway. I left anyway. Drove to Connecticut with barely any money and no real plan. Got this job. Started taking classes online. She looked at Oliver directly. And you know what? It was still hard. I'm still figuring things out. I still don't know if I made the right choice. But at least I'm trying something different instead of staying stuck. That's really brave, Oliver said quietly. It's not brave. It's just, what else was I going to do? Stay frozen in fear? At some point, you have to pick a direction and move, even if you're not sure where you're going. Georgia picked up her phone again. This dinner party isn't going to define your whole life. It's just one night. But how you prepare for it, whether you actually try or just hope for the best, that matters. Oliver took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly. Okay, record me. You sure? No, but like you said, do it anyway. Georgia pressed record. Whenever you're ready. Oliver turned toward the fern, his posture stiff but present. Several seconds passed. Then, hi, I'm Oliver Whitmore. He paused, grimaced, continued. I'm Richard's son. It's nice to meet you. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, but he'd gotten through it. Now they respond, Georgia prompted. They say, nice to meet you too, Oliver. This is quite a house your family has? Oliver nodded, processing. Thanks. Yeah, we've lived here about 5 years. Do you live in Greenwich too? I'm actually based in Manhattan, but I get out to Connecticut occasionally. Beautiful area. It is. There's a nature preserve nearby that has some interesting hiking trails. Oliver was finding his rhythm now, his voice growing incrementally more steady. The vegetation is really diverse because of the mixed deciduous forest. Georgia stopped recording. See? You did it. You had an actual conversation about hiking trails I've never actually been to. Oliver ran his hands through his hair. I don't even hike. But you know about the preserve because you probably researched the plants there. You gave a real answer that could lead to more conversation. That's perfect. Georgia played back the video, watching Oliver watch himself. His eyes widened. I don't look as terrified as I felt. Exactly. The internal experience is always worse than the external reality. Georgia saved the video. Here's what we're doing for the rest of this week. Every morning we escalate. Today, you introduced yourself. Tomorrow, you'll handle follow-up questions. Sunday, we practice the dinner table scenario with multiple plants. Monday, you're doing a full mock conversation about college plans. That's a lot. You have 7 days to prepare for something that terrifies you. It needs to be a lot. Georgia stood, offering him a hand up. But you just proved you can do this. You committed. You pushed through the fear and did the thing anyway. Oliver took her hand, letting her pull him to his feet. Standing there among his plants, morning light illuminating the space around them, he looked different somehow, still anxious, still uncertain, but no longer quite so defeated. Same time tomorrow? He asked. Same time tomorrow, Georgia confirmed. As she headed downstairs to begin her actual work, Georgia realized something had shifted. This wasn't just about helping Oliver practice small talk anymore. It was about proving to both of them that change was possible, that fear didn't have to be permanent, that commitment mattered even when success wasn't guaranteed. The dinner party was in 7 days. They both knew that might not be enough time, but they were going to try anyway. The Sunday afternoon brought unexpected sunshine and something Georgia hadn't anticipated, Oliver's first real victory. She'd arrived that morning to find him already awake and animated, a stark contrast to the boy who usually emerged from his room around noon, looking like he'd been wrestling with insomnia all night. He was rearranging his plants into a dinner table configuration, complete with place settings he'd borrowed from the formal dining room downstairs. I've been practicing, he announced, before Georgia even set down her bag. Watch this. He positioned himself at the head of his makeshift table, addressed a cluster of succulents to his right, and launched into a fluid introduction that included his name, a self-deprecating joke about being homeschooled, and a smooth transition into asking about their work. The succulents naturally didn't respond, but Oliver filled in their parts without hesitation, creating a back and forth that actually sounded like conversation. Georgia was stunned. How long have you been practicing? Since 5 this morning. I couldn't sleep, so I just started talking. Oliver's face was flushed with excitement, and something clicked. It's like once I did it enough times, my brain stopped treating it as this impossible thing and started treating it like a pattern I could follow. That's amazing, right? And look, Oliver pulled out his phone, scrolling through a notes app filled with conversation templates. I made these guides for different scenarios. If someone asks about school, I have 3 possible responses depending on how formal they are. If they ask about hobbies, I can talk about botanical illustration without seeming too weird. I even have backup topics if there's an awkward silence. Georgia scanned through his notes, impressed by the thoroughness. He'd essentially created a conversational choose-your-own-adventure, complete with exit strategies and pivot points. You really went all in on this, because it's working. Oliver's smile was genuine, unguarded in a way Georgia had never seen. Yesterday I was terrified. Today I feel like I might actually survive this dinner. They spent the next hour running through scenarios, and Oliver handled each one with increasing ease. When Georgia threw him a curveball, pretending to be a client who asked inappropriately personal questions about his family, he deflected with grace. When she simulated a long, awkward pause, he filled it naturally by asking about the fictional client's drive to Greenwich. "You're ready for the easy stuff," Georgia admitted. "The surface-level small talk, the polite exchanges, you've got those down. There's a but coming. I can hear it. But the dinner party won't just be easy stuff. Your dad will probably want you to talk about your plans, your goals, maybe even put you on the spot to demonstrate that you're a capable young man worth impressing." Georgia softened her voice. "The real test isn't whether you can make small talk. It's whether you can handle pressure without shutting down." Some of Oliver's confidence dimmed. "How do I practice that?" "We make it harder." Georgia stood up, gesturing for him to do the same. "Come on, we're leaving the room." "What? Why?" "Because you're comfortable here. You've turned this into a safe space where you control everything. But at the dinner, you won't have that control." Georgia was already heading toward the door. "We're going to the actual dining room, and you're going to practice there." Oliver's face went pale. "What if someone sees me talking to plants in the dining room? That's so much worse than doing it up here. Your mom's at her book club, and your dad's at the office." "It's just us." Georgia paused at the doorway. "Unless you want to quit while you're ahead." The challenge worked. Oliver grabbed his fiddle-leaf fig, the tallest, most impressive plant, and followed her downstairs. The formal dining room was everything Oliver's plant-filled sanctuary wasn't: cold, elegant, intimidating. A chandelier hung over a table that could seat 16. Oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls. The chairs were uncomfortable by design, the kind that reminded you to sit up straight and mind your manners. Oliver stood in the doorway, hugging his plant like a security blanket. "This is a terrible idea. It's a brilliant idea." "Set up!" With visible reluctance, Oliver placed the fiddle-leaf fig at one end of the massive table and took a seat several chairs away. The plant looked absurd in the formal setting, which was precisely the point. "Okay," Georgia said, settling into a chair across from him. "Your dad just asked you to tell his most important client about your college plans. Everyone's looking at you. Go." Oliver opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He looked at the plant, then at Georgia, then back at the plant. The confidence from upstairs had evaporated entirely. "I can't," he managed finally. "Yes, you can. You literally just did this 20 minutes ago. That was different. This room," Oliver gestured helplessly at the oppressive formality surrounding them. "This is where we had Thanksgiving dinner last year. My dad made me give a speech about what I was grateful for, and I completely froze. I just stood there in front of everyone until my mom pretended to get a phone call and created a distraction." Georgia understood. They weren't just in a different room. They were in a space loaded with bad memories, past failures, accumulated shame. All the practice in the world couldn't erase that instantly. "Okay, new approach." Georgia got up and moved the fiddle-leaf fig directly in front of Oliver. "Forget the formal scenario. Just tell the plant about that Thanksgiving. What happened, how you felt. Why? Because you need to stop running from the bad memories. They're making this room scarier than it needs to be." Georgia sat back down. "Talk to the plant about Thanksgiving." Oliver stared at the fiddle-leaf fig for a long moment. Then quietly, "It was the worst day. My dad had invited business partners and their families. I was supposed to stand up and give this toast about gratitude and family, really simple stuff. But when I stood up, everyone stopped talking and looked at me, and I just blanked, my mind completely emptied. I could feel my dad getting angry, could see his clients exchanging glances like, "What's wrong with this kid?" And the longer I stood there, the worse it got. His voice was shaking now, but he kept going. My mom tried to help by starting to speak for me, which somehow made it more humiliating. Like even she didn't think I could do it. Eventually, I just sat down without saying anything. My dad didn't speak to me for 3 days afterward. Oliver looked at Georgia, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "So yeah, this room kind of destroys any confidence I managed to build up." "That sounds awful," Georgia said simply. "Genuinely awful. But here's the thing, that was last year. You're different now. I don't feel different. You talked to a plant for 5 minutes about one of your worst memories without completely falling apart. Last week you couldn't even maintain eye contact with me." Georgia leaned forward. "The room has bad associations, but those are just ghosts. They only have power if you let them." Oliver wiped at his eyes quickly. "That sounds like something a therapist would say. Probably because it's true." Georgia smiled. "Try again. Not the college question, that's too loaded. Just introduce yourself to the plant like you're meeting someone new. Prove to yourself that you can do it in this room." Oliver took several deep breaths. His hands were trembling, but he turned to face the fiddle-leaf fig with determination. "Hi, I'm Oliver Whitmore. Welcome to our home." His voice wavered but held. "That chandelier up there is actually from France. My mom's really into antiques. Do you collect anything?" It wasn't smooth. It wasn't perfect. But it was real, and it was happening in the room where he'd previously failed. "Keep going," Georgia encouraged. "They just said they collect vintage maps." "Oh, that's cool. Maps are interesting because," Oliver continued, gradually finding his rhythm again. The room was still intimidating, the memories still present, but he was speaking anyway, pushing through the fear rather than being paralyzed by it. When he finished, he looked exhausted but triumphant. "I did it. You did it," Georgia confirmed. "And tomorrow we make it even harder." Oliver groaned, but he was smiling. For the first time, he actually believed he might survive the dinner party. Neither of them realized yet that surviving it wasn't going to be the real challenge. The real challenge would be what came after. Tuesday morning, 3 days before the dinner party, everything fell apart. Georgia arrived at the estate to find Mrs. Whitmore waiting in the kitchen, her carefully composed expression cracking at the edges. Behind her, raised voices echoed from somewhere upstairs, Oliver and his father, locked in what sounded like a brutal argument. "I should have told you sooner," Mrs. Whitmore said, wrapping her hands around a coffee mug she wasn't drinking from. "Richard found out about the practice sessions with the plants." George's stomach dropped. "How?" "Oliver mentioned it yesterday at breakfast. He was excited, said he'd been working on his conversation skills." Mrs. Whitmore's voice was hollow. Richard asked how, and Oliver told him. He thought his father would be pleased that he was trying. The shouting upstairs intensified. Georgia could make out Richard's words now. Absolute embarrassment, and talking to plants like a child. "Richard thinks it's ridiculous," Mrs. Whitmore continued, stating the obvious. "He thinks Oliver's wasting time on nonsense instead of just forcing himself to act normal. He's been up there for 20 minutes telling Oliver that he's coddling himself, that real confidence comes from just doing the thing, not practicing with houseplants." Georgia felt anger flare in her chest. "But it's working. Oliver's made real progress." "I know. I've seen the difference in him these past few days. But Richard..." Mrs. Whitmore trailed off, and for a moment Georgia saw past the polished exterior to the exhausted woman underneath. "Richard sees what he wants to see, and what he wants to see is a son who doesn't need special accommodations or creative solutions. A son who just fits." The shouting stopped abruptly. Footsteps thundered down the stairs, and Richard Whitmore appeared in the kitchen doorway, straightening his tie with sharp, angry movements. He was a tall man with greying hair and the kind of face that had been handsome once, but had hardened into something severe. His eyes landed on Georgia, You're the housekeeper. It wasn't a question. Georgia nodded anyway. My wife tells me you've been conducting therapy sessions with my son, using my plants. His voice was controlled but laced with contempt. I'd like to know what qualifications you have to be playing psychologist with a vulnerable teenager. I'm not playing psychologist, Georgia said, keeping her voice level despite her racing heart. I'm just helping him practice conversation. That's all. By having him talk to plants. Richard laughed, but there was no warmth in it. Do you have any idea how that sounds? How that looks? I'm trying to raise a son who can function in the real world, not someone who needs botanical training wheels for basic social interaction. The method doesn't matter if it works. It doesn't work. Richard's control slipped. You've convinced him he can hide behind gimmicks instead of developing actual skills. Friday night, he's going to be sitting at a table with some of the most successful people in pharmaceutical distribution, and you've prepared him by having him chat with ferns. Do you understand how catastrophically that's going to fail? Georgia wanted to argue, wanted to defend Oliver and the genuine progress he'd made, but Richard wasn't finished. You're fired, effective immediately. I want you out of this house within the hour. He turned to his wife. Diane, make sure she collects her things and goes. I don't want her filling Oliver's head with any more of this nonsense. He left without waiting for a response, his briefcase clicking shut in the foyer moments before the front door slammed. The silence he left behind was crushing. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Whitmore whispered. I tried to talk to him last night, tried to explain that Oliver was improving, but he wouldn't listen. Georgia's hands were shaking. She'd known this job was too good to last, but she'd thought she'd at least finish the semester, save a little more money, before having to find something else. Now she was being thrown out 3 days before Oliver's big test, right when he needed support most. Can I at least say goodbye to him? Georgia asked. Mrs. Whitmore hesitated, glancing toward the stairs. Richard said, I know what he said, but Oliver's going to think I abandoned him. Please. After a long moment, Mrs. Whitmore nodded. 5 minutes. Then you really do need to leave. I can't afford to fight Richard on this right now. Georgia took the stairs 2 at a time, her heart pounding. She found Oliver in his room, sitting on the floor surrounded by his plants, his face blotchy from crying. When he saw her, he looked away quickly, ashamed. You heard, he said flatly. Yeah. Georgia sat down next to him, careful not to touch any of the plants he'd arranged in a protective circle around himself. Your dad fired me, I know. He made sure I knew, said it was my fault for being so pathetic that the housekeeper felt sorry for me. Oliver's voice cracked. He said the plant thing was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard. That I'm 17 years old and still can't handle basic conversation like a normal person. That he's tired of making excuses for me. Oliver, he's right though, isn't he? Oliver looked at her, and there was something broken in his expression. I mean, what was I thinking? That talking to plants would magically fix me. That I could just practice my way into being someone I'm not. The dinner's in 3 days, and I'm still the same anxious mess I've always been. Worse, actually, because now I got you fired. You didn't get me fired. Your father's inability to see your progress got me fired. Georgia kept her voice firm. And you're not the same. You've made real improvements. Improvements at talking to plants. Oliver's voice rose, which is completely useless in the actual situation. My dad's right. I've been hiding behind a stupid gimmick instead of facing reality. And reality is that I'm broken, and no amount of creative practice is going to fix that. Georgia recognized the spiral. She'd seen it in herself when her engagement fell apart, when she dropped out of school, when every failure seemed to confirm that she was fundamentally incapable of getting her life right. The way setbacks could erase all progress in an instant, making you forget you'd ever moved forward at all. Listen to me, she said urgently. Your father is wrong. What you've been doing isn't a gimmick. It's a legitimate technique. Athletes visualize performances before competing. Actors rehearse in safe environments before going on stage. You've been doing the exact same thing. It doesn't matter. Oliver's voice was hollow. Even if it was working, I can't do it anymore. My dad threw all my practice notes in the trash. Said if he catches me talking to the plants again, he's donating them all to a botanical garden. These plants are the only things in my life that I've successfully taken care of, and now I can't even have that. Oliver, you should go. My dad's probably timing you. Oliver drew his knees up to his chest, making himself smaller. Thanks for trying. I'm sorry it didn't work out. Georgia wanted to stay, wanted to somehow fix this. But Mrs. Whitmore appeared in the doorway with an apologetic expression that meant time was up. As Georgia descended the stairs for the last time, her mind raced through possibilities. She could call Richard, try to reason with him, but he'd made his position clear. She could reach out to Mrs. Whitmore later, but what could a woman who couldn't even advocate for her own son do? She could message Oliver, but without the daily practice sessions, without the structure they'd built, would words alone be enough? By the time Georgia reached her car, she'd accepted the painful truth. There was nothing she could do. She tried to help, and it had backfired spectacularly. Oliver was on his own now, facing a dinner party in 3 days, with his confidence shattered and his support system ripped away. She sat in her Honda for a long moment, staring at the estate through her rearview mirror, feeling the weight of failure settle over her shoulders. Some people, she thought bitterly, were just unlucky. Some problems didn't have creative solutions. Some kids didn't get the support they needed, no matter how hard they tried or who tried to help them. Georgia started the car and drove away, leaving Oliver behind. She told herself she'd done everything she could. She almost believed it. Georgia spent Wednesday cleaning her apartment. It didn't need cleaning. The studio was so small that mess was barely possible, but she needed to do something with her hands while her mind churned through the wreckage of the past 24 hours. She scrubbed the kitchenette counters until they gleamed, reorganized her closet by color, even attempted to fix the perpetually dripping bathroom faucet with a YouTube tutorial and a wrench borrowed from her downstairs neighbor. Nothing worked. The faucet still dripped. Her thoughts still spiraled. She'd checked her bank account that morning. $3,147. Enough for maybe 2 months of rent and basic expenses if she was careful, less if any emergencies came up. She'd already started scanning job listings, but the truth was that the Whitmore position had paid significantly above market rate. Anything else would mean longer hours for less money, which meant dropping her online classes, which meant her degree slipping even further out of reach. But that wasn't what kept her awake Wednesday night. Staring at the water-stained ceiling while car alarms and distant sirens provided the soundtrack to her insomnia. What kept her awake was the image of Oliver's face when she'd left, the defeat in his eyes, the way he'd curled into himself like he was trying to disappear. She kept replaying the conversation, wondering if she'd said the right things, if there was something more she could have done, if leaving had been the right choice, even though she'd had no other option. Around 2 a.m, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. It's Oliver. Got your number from my mom's phone. You don't have to respond. Georgia sat up, suddenly wide awake. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, the dinner is tomorrow night. I can't do it. I've been trying to work myself up to telling my dad I'm sick or something, but I can't even do that. I can't face him to tell him I can't face other people. How pathetic is that? Georgia's thumbs hovered over the keyboard. What could she possibly say that would help? My dad was right. I'm not fixable. Some people just aren't built for normal life. That broke through her paralysis. Georgia called him immediately. He answered on the first ring, his voice rough like he'd been crying. You shouldn't have called, Oliver said. You'll get in trouble. I'm already fired. What else can your dad do to me? Georgia kept her voice gentle. Talk to me. What's going on? Everything's going on. Nothing's going on. I've been in my room since you left, and I can't stop thinking about how I ruined everything. I got you fired. I disappointed my dad again, and tomorrow I'm going to sit at that dinner table and prove to everyone that I'm exactly the failure they think I am. Oliver. And the worst part, his voice broke. The absolute worst part is that for a few days I actually believed I could change. I thought I was getting better, but that was just an illusion, wasn't it? I wasn't actually improving. I was just getting better at pretending with plants. The second real pressure appeared. I completely collapsed. Georgia heard the echo of her own thoughts in his words, the way failure could make you rewrite history, convincing you that any progress had been imaginary, that you'd been fooling yourself the entire time. "Can I tell you what I've been thinking about?" Georgia asked. "Okay, I've been thinking about whether I should have done things differently. Whether I pushed you too hard or not hard enough. Whether the plant method was actually helpful or just made things worse." She paused. "And you know what conclusion I came to? That it was a waste of time? That it doesn't matter." Georgia surprised herself with the certainty in her voice. "It doesn't matter what method we used, or whether your dad approved, or whether you're fixed or not. What matters is that you tried. You showed up every morning. You did the uncomfortable thing even when it scared you. That's not nothing, Oliver. That's actually everything." Silence on the other end. "Then, but I still can't handle the dinner." "Maybe not. Or maybe you can and you just don't believe it yet." Georgia lay back down, phone pressed to her ear. "Here's what I know. Your dad is wrong about you. You're not broken. You're not pathetic. You're a 17-year-old kid with anxiety who's been made to feel defective for having a completely normal struggle that millions of people deal with. It doesn't feel normal. I know. But that doesn't make it true." Georgia chose her next words carefully. "The dinner tomorrow, it's going to be hard. You might freeze up. You might have awkward silences. You might not perform the way your dad wants you to. But those things don't define your worth as a person. They're just things that might happen. So what do I do? You show up. You sit at the table. And you try, not to be perfect, not to prove something to your dad, but just to try. To see what happens when you don't run away." Georgia's voice softened. "And if it goes badly, it goes badly. You survive it and move forward. But at least you'll know you faced it instead of hiding." Oliver was quiet for a long time. Georgia could hear him breathing, could imagine him in his room, surrounded by plants he wasn't allowed to talk to anymore. "I don't think I'm brave enough," he said finally. "Bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about being terrified and doing it anyway." Georgia thought about her own choices, leaving New Mexico, starting over in Connecticut, trying to help Oliver despite having no qualifications. "You've already been brave. You've been brave every morning you practiced. You were brave when you told your dad about it, even though it backfired. You're being brave right now by calling me instead of suffering alone. It doesn't feel brave. It feels like drowning. Sometimes those are the same thing." Georgia checked the time, 2:37 a.m. "Listen, I can't be there tomorrow. I can't coach you through it or help you practice. But you don't need me for this. You've already learned everything you need. You just have to trust that it's there when you need it. And if I trust it and it's not there, then you stumble through anyway. You use the conversation templates you created. You ask questions instead of trying to have perfect answers. You remember that everyone at that table has been nervous in social situations before. They're not aliens, they're just people." Georgia's voice turned firm. "And most importantly, you remember that one dinner party doesn't determine your entire future. It's just one night out of thousands you're going to live." Oliver exhaled slowly. "I saved your number. Can I text you after? Even if it goes terribly. Especially if it goes terribly. I want to hear about it either way." "Okay." A pause. "Georgia? Thank you. For everything. Even if it didn't work out the way we planned, it's not over yet. The story doesn't end tomorrow night, no matter what happens." After they hung up, Georgia lay in the darkness, wondering if anything she'd said would make a difference. Oliver was still alone in that house with parents who didn't understand him, still facing a situation that terrified him, still believing deep down that he was fundamentally broken. But he'd called. That had to mean something. Georgia finally fell asleep around 4, and when she did, she dreamed of a greenhouse full of plants that whispered encouragement in voices that sounded like hope. Thursday crawled by. Georgia applied for 3 housekeeping positions, had 1 phone screening that went nowhere, and spent the evening obsessively checking her phone, even though Oliver wouldn't text until after the dinner. Friday was worse. The dinner was scheduled for 7 o'clock. Georgia knew, because she'd seen it on the Whitmore family calendar weeks ago, back when she still worked there. Back when she'd believed she could actually help. She tried to distract herself with a movie, but couldn't focus. Tried reading, but gave up after realizing she'd read the same page 4 times without absorbing anything. At 6:55 p.m., she was pacing her tiny apartment, her phone gripped in her hand like a lifeline. 7 o'clock came and went, then 8, then 9, no messages. Georgia told herself that was probably good. Oliver was busy navigating the dinner, too occupied to text. But as the hours stretched on, darker possibilities crept in. Maybe it had gone so catastrophically that Oliver couldn't bear to tell her. Maybe he'd had a complete breakdown. Maybe his parents had taken his phone away. At 10:47 p.m., her phone finally buzzed. Georgia grabbed it so fast she nearly dropped it. But the message wasn't from Oliver. It was from Mrs. Whitmore, Georgia. "I think you should come by tomorrow morning, if you're available. Oliver is asking for you. Something happened tonight, and he needs to talk to you about it, please." Diane Georgia stared at the message, her heart hammering. Something happened. What did that mean? Good something? Bad something? Catastrophic something? She typed and deleted 3 different responses before settling on, "I'll be there at 8 a.m. She didn't sleep that night. She just waited. Georgia arrived at the Whitmore estate at exactly 8 o'clock Saturday morning. Her stomach twisted in knots. Mrs. Whitmore met her at the front door before she could even knock. Looking exhausted but wearing an expression Georgia couldn't quite read. "He's in the conservatory," Mrs. Whitmore said, leading Georgia through the house. "That's where he's been since last night. What happened at the dinner?" Mrs. Whitmore didn't answer, just pushed open a set of French doors Georgia had never been through before. Beyond them lay a glass-enclosed space she hadn't known existed, a genuine conservatory filled with even more plants than Oliver's room. Bathed in morning light, Oliver sat on a wrought-iron bench, still wearing his dress shirt from the dinner, though he'd loosened the tie and rolled up his sleeves. When he saw Georgia, his face broke into a smile that was equal parts exhausted and exhilarated. "You came." "Of course I came. Your mom's text scared me half to death." Georgia sat beside him, studying his face for clues. "What happened? Are you okay?" "I'm better than okay." Oliver laughed, running his hands through his hair. "I did it, Georgia. I actually did it." Relief flooded through her. "The dinner went well." "No." Oliver's smile widened at her confusion. "It was a disaster. But also it was the best thing that's ever happened to me." Mrs. Whitmore had settled into a chair near the door, watching them with an expression of quiet wonder. Oliver glanced at her, then back at Georgia. "The dinner started exactly how I feared. 6 of my dad's clients and their spouses, all successful and polished and perfectly comfortable. I was supposed to sit there and make conversation and prove I was normal." Oliver's voice steadied as he spoke, like he'd been waiting to tell this story. "And for the first 20 minutes I tried. I really tried. I asked someone about their drive, mentioned the weather, did all the things we practiced. That's good. But I was still terrified. My answers were too short, my timing was off, and I could see my dad watching me with this look like he was just waiting for me to fail completely." Oliver stood up, too energized to sit still. Then one of the clients, this woman named Patricia Chen, asked what I was interested in studying, and I froze, just completely blanked, exactly like always. George's heart sank. "Oliver, wait, let me finish. I'm frozen, right? Everyone's staring. My dad's getting that angry look. And then I looked at the centerpiece on the table, this arrangement of orchids and ferns, and something just clicked." Oliver turned to face her fully. "I thought about what you said on the phone, about how the method didn't matter, about how I just needed to try. And I realized I'd been doing it all wrong." "What do you mean?" "I'd been trying to use the plant practice as a way to become someone else, someone who doesn't have anxiety, who's naturally good at conversation, who doesn't need help. But that's not what the practice was actually teaching me." Oliver's voice grew more animated. It was teaching me that conversation doesn't have to be perfect, that it's okay to stumble, that people are just plants with more complex responses. They're all just trying to connect, even badly. Georgia felt something shift in her understanding. "So what did you do?" "I told the truth." Oliver sat back down, his eyes bright. "I told Patricia Chen that I'd completely blanked on her question because I have social anxiety and formal dinners terrify me, but that I'd been working on it by practicing conversations with plants, which I knew sounded ridiculous, but had actually helped me realize that most conversations are just two people trying their best to connect." "You told them about the plants?" Georgia couldn't hide her shock. "I told them everything. About being homeschooled because regular school was too overwhelming. About the tutors who gave up on me. About how you helped me practice with my philodendron and my fiddle leaf fig, and how my dad thought it was stupid, but it had been the first thing that actually worked." Oliver's voice cracked slightly. "And you know what happened?" Georgia shook her head, unable to speak. Patricia Chen laughed, not at me, but like she got it. "And she told everyone at the table that her daughter has anxiety too, that she's been in therapy for years, that it's something like 40 million Americans deal with." Oliver's eyes glistened. "Then someone else mentioned that their son sees a therapist for social anxiety, and someone else talked about how they used to practice presentations in front of their dog. And suddenly, everyone was sharing their own struggles, their own weird coping mechanisms, their own stories about being scared and finding ways through it." Mrs. Whitmore spoke up from her chair. "It was extraordinary. I've hosted dozens of these dinners, and they're usually so formal, so performative. But last night turned into this honest conversation about vulnerability and mental health and parenthood. Patricia's husband even asked Richard directly how he was supporting Oliver through his anxiety. "What did Dad say?" Georgia asked. Oliver's smile faded slightly. "He didn't handle it well at first. He tried to minimize it, said I just needed to toughen up. But Patricia pushed back. She said that mentality was exactly why so many kids don't get the help they need. That successful people aren't the ones who never struggle. They're the ones who find strategies to work with their struggles instead of pretending they don't exist." That must have been hard for him to hear. It was. He excused himself halfway through dessert. Oliver looked toward the house. "But this morning he came to find me here. We talked for 2 hours. Really talked, not just him lecturing me. He admitted that he didn't know how to help me, that watching me struggle scared him because he couldn't fix it. He apologized for firing you, for throwing away my practice notes, for making me feel broken." Georgia felt tears prick at her eyes. "That's huge, Oliver. He's not suddenly perfect. He still thinks I should probably try exposure therapy with a real professional. He still worries about my future, but at least now he's listening, instead of just dismissing everything as weakness." Oliver reached over and took Georgia's hand. "And he wants to rehire you. If you'll come back." "Oliver, I don't know if—" "Not as a housekeeper." Mrs. Whitmore stood up, moving closer. "Richard and I talked this morning as well. We'd like to hire you as Oliver's companion and mentor. Someone who can continue working with him on social skills, yes, but also just be in his corner. Someone who sees him as a person rather than a problem to solve." George's mind reeled. "I'm not qualified for that." "You're more qualified than anyone else we've found," Mrs. Whitmore said gently. "You helped Oliver more in 2 weeks than therapists did in 3 years. Not because you had credentials, but because you treated him like he mattered. The pay would be better," Oliver added quickly. "Enough that you could take more classes, maybe even go full-time eventually. And you'd have actual hours, not just whenever I need help. My mom already worked it out." Georgia looked between them, seeing hope and possibility where there had been only failure and endings. The job offer was tempting, more than tempting. But something else mattered more. "Did you learn what you needed to?" she asked Oliver. "Not from me, but from all of this. The practice, the failure, the dinner?" Oliver considered the question seriously. "I learned that I'm not going to wake up one day magically cured. The anxiety is part of me, and it probably always will be. But I also learned that I'm not broken. I'm just wired differently, and that's okay. I can work with it instead of fighting it. And the plants? Are you still going to talk to them? Definitely. But now I know they're not a crutch. They're just one tool in a bigger toolkit. Oliver smiled. Plus, they're excellent listeners and they never interrupt. Georgia found herself laughing through tears. Okay, yes, I'll take the job. Oliver pulled her into a hug, and Mrs. Whitmore was smiling, and through the conservatory windows, Georgia could see the estate gardens stretching out in the morning light. Everything green and growing and alive with possibility. 3 months later, Oliver enrolled in a community college botany program. He still got anxious before classes, still struggled with group projects, still had bad days where the world felt too overwhelming. But he also made one friend, then two. He started a campus club about sustainable gardening. He even gave a presentation about using horticultural therapy for anxiety management, which he delivered while standing next to a potted fern he'd brought for moral support. Georgia finished her associate degree that spring and got accepted into a bachelor's program starting in the fall. She moved out of her studio above the dry cleaner and into a small cottage on the Whitmore property that had been converted into a guest house. She filled it with plants Oliver gave her, cuttings and offshoots from his ever-expanding collection. And sometimes, when Oliver was preparing for something difficult, a job interview, a first date, a family gathering, they'd still practice with the plants first. Not because he needed to, but because some rituals were worth keeping. Some methods worked not because they were conventional, but because they were true. Years later, when Oliver opened his own greenhouse business specializing in therapeutic plant programs for people with anxiety, he kept a philodendron in his office. The same one he'd had since he was 14. The first plant he hadn't killed. On its pot, he'd attached a small plaque that read, "Some conversations start in the strangest places. Keep growing." And every day, whether clients were watching or not, he'd talk to it. Just for a minute, just to remember that sometimes the most important growth happens in the quiet spaces between words, in the patient practice of becoming, in the courage to try again after failing, that nobody's broken, just growing at their own pace, and that sometimes the right person believes in you just enough to help you believe in yourself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.